You want David. You're giving the whole David
The
experience.
David experience. Can you give me a brief, like, bullet points of what the David experience is?
Well, I don't know that I could give you a bullet point because it changes from person to event to season, I guess.
Mhm.
Also, I can give you the adjectives often associated with the David experience.
Okay.
Subdued, obnoxious, memorable, chocolate.
Is that a preview for the podcast?
Sure.
Hey, Edibuddies, and welcome back to the Edibuddies podcast. I'm your host, Kara. I'm an editor, and on my podcast, we talk about writing, editing, and the friends, or in this case, more than friends, you can make along the way. Today, I am speaking with a media producer, a pop culture journalist, a marketing and brand consultant, and a nerd who just likes comic books. These all happen to be the same person, and as of May 11th, 2024, he also happens to be my husband, David Nieves. I am so happy to have David on, and not just because he's asked me about it so much, he even brought it up in our wedding vows. We met about 7 years ago through a local pop culture convention, and we didn't actually share very many of the same interests. He was more into comics and pro wrestling. I'm into Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. But one thing that we connected over was our ability to see how a story could be made stronger. For me, a lifelong book lover, this led to me becoming an editor. For David, this has meant becoming many, many different things over the years. His resume features stops in television and video game studios, pro wrestling promotions, major brand marketing departments. I guess I should just let him tell you about it.
Anybody that knows me knows that comic books are what defines my decor schemes and personality. Because it's just one of those things for me. Started at a young age. Like a lot of people in the '90s, I saw X-Men, then picked up a comic book, and never looked back after that. And that was a time too where you couldn't really like those things and be considered cool because that was a time in society where that stuff wasn't as accepted as it was today, or there wasn't enough connection in the world for me to reach out to people or other kids my age who really liked that stuff. So it's kind of all I had for a moment. And I think from there, it just sort of evolved through other things that got into, like uh, watching television and wrestling on television. All those things have so many elements of story that I didn't really realize as a kid, but now I do, and I can see that a lot of that is where I got my love and my passion to those things from.
Mm-hmm. So when we first started hanging out, I remember we went out to dinner and you were telling me a little bit about your history and background, and you had said that I think it was when you were in college, you like basically decided you wanted to work in comics, you wanted to work in television, and you wanted to work in pro wrestling.
Well, yes, the resume part of it really, I mean, you really kind of have to start with, as in all things in my life, started finding out the things I didn't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because before all that, for a really long time, I worked, retail jobs and things like that I hated. People have those jobs out of necessity, and some people like them and they make them a career. And I see that now, no knocking against them, but it wasn't really something I wanted to do. I grew up in a family that success was defined by how many hours you put in on the clock, like a lot of people did, and that it wasn't the most encouraging thing in the world. but I see the practicality of it now. But so when in 2019, I had actually, that had been almost 8 years that I had gone back to college and then kind of started that journey of, hey, I'm going to do something with the things that I love. I wasted a lot of time, so I got to get through them all really fast.
So that was around 2011 that you kind of came to that realization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then going to college got me kind of a weird doorways open that got me into things or businesses tangentially, such as the comic book industry, journalism for a while through that, then the video game industry, then into sort of where I am now, marketing along the way. And along the way, there was a lot of stops that it's a weird Walter Mitty type life.
It really is,
Yeah, it
though.
is when I think about it now. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you go to college for?
I so I went to college for film and television, which when I think about it now was probably I always kind of looked at it, and because I didn't have $100,000 job right out of college, I always looked at it as a mistake. But I did learn a lot of things that weren't in those books or lectures about how to how to essentially do business. Weirdly enough, also how to like have dinner in a business way where I had this I don't know if you've noticed this in all times we've been together and eaten together. I have a strange way of holding my knife and fork when I things that most people will hold it with like an index finger towards like tip of the fork and cut through there. I hold the fork like by the by the longest part imaginable, and I'm like this, and
You
I
learned that in college?
I learned how to eat properly around people that I didn't know or were trying to do business with. So it was like if someone else isn't drinking, you don't drink, or where to sit down in terms of how to have the attention on you, how to give up a seat to somebody that you're trying to impress and do business with. There's a lot of stuff to. So this one professor who um, taught me a lot of this, or two guys actually. One was named Stu Rosen, who was an Emmy-winning producer of kids shows like in the 70s, I think. And the other was I don't remember what his first name was, but I know his last name was Hirsch. He used to have an Emmy in his office too for I think it was some kind of public access show that he was a really knowledgeable guy too in terms of hey, just attempt this, message this person, make this ask because the worst that they can say is no. And then you move on and you try the next goal. So I
Hmm.
think that's what I really took away more than anything in college. I'm sure there are a lot of like technical skills involving cameras and shots. And you've seen things that I talk about to people now when I see others doing things that aren't on the level that I think they should be. I'm one of the few people who is in marketing that can back it up and say, hey, this is how it's going to be. This is technically step by step how to get there.
Yeah. Well, while you were in your classes, so you weren't just, I was going to say, you weren't just learning the technical stuff that normally goes along with a degree like that. You were learning about the business of putting things together and of creating a network, which is really what the media business is about.
It's really part of it is learning in a way to be a producer and what that actually means because when you watch things on television or movies and you see producer by their title, it's just a random word that you don't really know all that goes into it. And for a long time, I didn't know what goes into it. I didn't know what goes into being a line producer, an executive producer. Then you learn sort of, hey, if you are making an introduction or if you make anything happen in some way, that's part of what producing is.
Hmm.
And I got lucky. Well, I got lucky and unlucky enough in college that I was older than everybody. I was working with people that were younger. They were way better at doing cinematography, putting out their ideas that were more in touch with younger demographics at the time. So I fell kind of into the role in those days of, hey, I'm coordinated. I really adapted very quickly to how to be presentable to the business side of things and put those things together. And along the way too, I used a lot of what I learned in writing to help them craft sort of like student projects and indie projects that they were trying to get off the ground and help them to say like, hey, this could be better, this could be shorter, this could be more streamlined. It was all technical, but it also still was part of the storytelling process for like film and television back then.
So you had been doing writing with comics journaling prior to going to college, is that right?
Mm. No, no. So that actually came about after college as well. So, like in the timeline of events, 2009, I don't know, half get fired from a Best Buy, half quit. It's a weird story that then 2010, 2011, I go back to college, and while I'm learning things in college, almost simultaneously, I'm able to sort of implement them um, into the real world at the same time because so it was about 2010, 2011 that I also had time. So I volunteered at a comic book convention in Long Beach. And and because I had that time, I stuck around, I helped more and I did this. And the people that ran that took notice. And you've met one of
Hmm.
those guys, Mike Sigliano, who is kind of like was the doorway into all this for that part for me. And then as I was kind of, oh, I'm helping there, I'm doing this, they figured out, hey, he's good at writing. So they got me into the first ever, I think it was a magazine called Cosplay Culture in like their first issue. They knew the guy who was editing that and putting it together, and he needed contributors or specific article pieces, and they were very happy to introduce us and say, hey, here's this kid in college. He's a good writer. You should give him a shot. And so I wrote something for them. Then that same year, I ended up writing something, I think it was that year or the year after, but I wrote something for the San Diego Comic Con souvenir book on the anniversary of Aspen Comics. Then that led to me covering covering a convention for Bleeding Cool, which was WonderCon, and then that's also where I kind of learned to work with an editor the first time. But um, I then after that, I found a tweet by a writer named Steve Niles that that was a retweet from a editor of a comics publication called Comics Beat. Heidi McDonald was her name, and she didn't have a lot of capital for her outlet, so she really relied on people who just kind of wanted to go to these big, massive events for free, which I was in college, so I needed to save money, so who wouldn't want to? So through that, I reached out to her and got an opportunity to cover San Diego Comic Con. She liked what I had to do, some of the ideas that I brought to the table. And so towards the end of college, in that like 2 to 3 years, I wrote for Comics Beat. I wrote reviews. I wrote editorials, opinions. I wrote. I really took an eye or a note from the drummer of one of my favorite bands, The Descendants, who was talking about something that happened to him, and his message was basically, do something, even do something that means something, even if it only means something to you. to which that's a lot of what I took in my writing, is that I only wanted to write about things that mattered to me. And I got to meet other writers from other publications like IGN who were into the same things I was. And so then from there, I was also working comic book conventions, Long Beach at the time. Then I got introduced to one of the show owners' wives worked for Nike, as her department was North American entertainment marketing, which is basically get shoes on celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked for her for a little bit in that company. And then from there, I just took off and did my own things, events. I learned a lot about marketing from her in that time. So I was able to like use it and roll into sort of working for myself and working for these other places like Sony. And yeah, so it's a really weird Forrest Gumpy kind of talk to have.
Yeah. You also really like to like drop seeds of like, oh yeah, and when I was in Japan doing this thing, and it's like, wait, when you were in Japan doing what? With who? Like what?
Yeah. So in was that 2017 now? Um, I helped to bring New Japan Pro Wrestling into the States for the first time, sort of introducing that company to venues and in Long Beach to where they held the first show. And from that, a business relationship sort of sprouted where I was an advisor on some things, and I got to go and see the workings of all this behind the scenes that I never really dreamed I would see.
Mhm.
And that was all due to just having a knowledge of, I love this thing that not a lot of people love and know about, which was Japanese wrestling. And then I also have a knowledge of the city of Long Beach and these venues, and kind of understanding that this company at the time was looking to branch out. And it sort of became a happenstance and a lot of cold email of, hey, have you thought about this location? Have you thought about this location? This is who you contact to get pricing and this and that. Not a lot of knowledge that many people have, but I was able to kind of put to good use to make that happen. And then that led to other parts of the wrestling business being open to me and getting to sort of see things that nobody else saw.
When did you first start writing? Because it wasn't because you got to college and they were like, hey, you can actually write. So when did that start for you?
It's strange, because that really all kind of came about. I went to college and I was able to have English professors, other professors for general eds, that they took notice and said, "Hey, you've got good ideas in your writing. You know how to alliterate yourself. You're a little weak in your structure, but this is what you do. I think you should do this." So it was like really in college where I was encouraged to write.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're encouraged to do something, even when you're not the best at it at the time, just encouragement alone goes a long way in making yourself or challenging yourself to be a better writer. So I'd say going back to college really was where I started writing, because I didn't really write in high school.
You were getting feedback from your college professors and everything, but it was when you went to Bleeding Cool that you actually really started having an editor who was working with you regularly. Can you talk about that a bit?
So yeah, that WonderCon was weird because I'd never covered anything in person or done anything like that. I just kind of said that so,
You bullshit. Okay.
so sorry, Rich. It turned out great.
Pro tip to all writers out there, just lie.
Just lie. Honestly, get there and then get better once you're there, and most people will forgive you.
Mm.
But see, the thing was covering a live event like that. So my thing was to go to panels and presentations where news was being delivered and write 500 or so words on what was going on. The new book was being announced, who was writing it, when was it going to be released, things like that. And so I did that. And it was when I first, the first editorial gate I had was really just sending it into someone that was supposed to post it online and them reading it at the time, which was the editor in chief of Bleeding Cool, Rich Johnson. And first time out, he immediately went back to me and was like, I need more. Like, this is incomplete. And I thought it wasn't. So he said, I need to know, you know, what was the reaction here? What was the crowd like here? What was this? So he really kind of steered me into like thinking about the details, what I was missing. And in journalism, they'll teach you of like, the who, what, where, why, when,
Sure.
but they don't teach you like what is all involved in capturing that. I think only an editor in the media sphere can really do that, especially an experienced one like him, like Heidi, because they know what their audience wants. So that really was my first time working with an editor. And it was, I think, like any writer, whether you're writing a book or anything, it's easy to sort of get down when you get any kind of note
Yeah.
and sort of be of the mindset, man, this person really hates what I'm doing. And to his credit, Rich really, it was not the case. He was in London at the time, so he wasn't in Los Angeles. But later on, when we would talk, he gave me like the in-person review and walked me through it. And it took away the pain,
Hmm.
or I don't know, pain's a strong word, but the discomfort
Yeah.
of working with an editor.
To have him sit there with you
Yeah.
through it. Yeah, absolutely. You are only the second person I think I've talked to on the podcast that I have actually edited, or has experienced my edit. Well, I guess I've worked on a few different projects with you because we've done marketing stuff together. We did that art book together, but then also you had like some personal stories.
Yeah. Okay. So it was during pandemic lockdown. So the ex vice president of Victory Records was being interviewed by me for Red Carpet Report on a new book about sort of emo bands and his experiences with them. And it's a good series. I recommend it to anyone. So during kind of like the pre-interview of this, he asked me a couple of things just about journalism and the entertainment industry. And I talked about some of my experiences being around so much of the comic book stuff. He knew people in the comic book industry, and we sort of knew some of the same people and some of the same experience about how to get into an industry the hard way. And he thought my stories about interviewing writers or creators like Chuck Palahniuk, Dave Mack would be good things to write for a book. So we talked a little bit about that. He wanted some test pages. I'd never written a book before, and I didn't know really whether to make it like a memoir or specifically just on each interview I've ever done, recollect them and do thoughts on them. I never really got that much guidance on it. It was just sort of like, hey, if you want to tell a story, do some test pages. And so I did. I I think I reached a point where my first couple of pages that I wrote felt unrevealing. I always thought that when you write about people or yourself, it has to reveal something,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's hard. So I tried writing about the people that I'd interviewed, but I really had nothing to reveal beyond what I had already said in the interviews. So I wrote a little bit of myself, and that got hard because I had to dig for things that, okay, what can I reveal about myself that is interesting that would put me in this place of, hey, I'm just like this person, or hey, this has been my journey so far, and this is why it's interesting. And so I wrote those pages. I knew at the time you were starting the business of freelance editing. And all the time I've known you, you've always been surrounded by story and literature, and you've really always soaked it in. So I knew you were very capable of being a critique on some things like that. So, and also I had no money. So
That's how most people find me.
I, so yeah, I came to you with some things from wrestling. I talked about some things from my younger days. And I think it was through working with you, it wasn't a sharpening of things, but really being able to be comfortable putting your vulnerability on a page. I think what you helped me do was put myself on that page, but still be presentable to the audience. Not, when I wrote them initially, I wrote like I talk. Like I can be monotone at times, I can be sarcastic, but I can also go, 100 miles an hour when I talk. And that's what I had initially written. And I think you pulled me back from a lot of that. There are things I didn't want to change just because I was very committed to them and it took a lot to get there. But in everything you suggested, you were very on point about it. So it worked for me.
It's interesting because, obviously I had never worked on anything like that before, but I really like what you said earlier about how a really good editor knows their audience. And I think that's how I've always approached editing, is that I'm always thinking about what is the reader's experience of this going to be. So when I'm looking at your pages, yeah, I know you. I can read the sarcasm in the tone, but the reader who doesn't know you isn't going to understand that. So then it's a question of, well, what are we getting at with the sarcasm? What's underneath that? And usually it's what's underneath is what is more impactful. I'm curious, like, you shared some pretty vulnerable things in that
Hmm.
stuff. And was that really difficult for you to like put things on paper were like really close to who you were, and also knowing that somebody else was going to read it and potentially give you thoughts on it? Like, what was that experience?
I think those are things that I probably always wanted to talk about, but
Mm.
just never felt like I could or had a reason to. It's not, it's stuff that comes up when you're having deep conversations with people, but it isn't something that you would bring up in your everyday life. You were reading incidents from my childhood, kind of being witnessing or witness
It's
to
traumatic events.
traumatic
Yeah,
events and
just
crimes. And when you're a teenager, early teen, you don't know how to process those things. So I never really talked about them with anybody. But in writing about them, it was very cathartic. And I think you really made me feel more comfortable about this being something I can present to try to sell why my story is interesting. And that's the hard thing to do as a writer when you're writing about yourself.
it is. Memoir is extremely difficult, and I mean, I think like every kind of writing you have to write because you love it, but memoir especially, it's like, don't write a memoir hoping to sell it and make money, because that's not what it's about.
That certainly didn't happen for me.
Yeah, that didn't happen for you. But I think you still could. I mean, you have a fascinating life. You have tons of like crazy stories that people would find fascinating.
I think I told you about the eventual post meeting about that, and the feedback I got was pretty much, this is interesting. I just don't know that this was what I thought of when I met you.
Yeah.
And that was a little hard to hear, but also I kind of got it. When I met this person, they had an impression of me that wasn't in those pages, but I didn't know what their impression of me was. So I couldn't really write to that or see if I had something in my experiences for that. My interviews with people were always really short, but they were oftentimes very weird or very memorable. So, like for an example, I mentioned Chuck Palahniuk. Chuck Palahniuk is the creator of Fight Club, first and foremost. That's
Yeah,
what
yeah.
people know him for. People also know him for being one of like the weirdest dudes around, but like in a very good way.
Mm.
So, this was a guy who gave like fake body parts with his signature to people that he liked,
Mm.
or like took pictures of him choking people. And for, it was for the sequel to Fight Club, which came out in comics, that my friend David Hyde got me an interview with him. And he had done a ton of press for this up to that point. I even saw him at conventions where he was doing nonstop press for it. So I knew he had been asked everything under the sun. And that interview's up on, hopefully is up on Comic Speed still. But I approached him in a way that was sort of different from everything. We talked about sort of how his characters then um, view the world now and the what ifs of things, and a lot about things that weren't in that story, but about social issues and things like it. I gave him an interview that I felt really good about. I never expect any sort of follow up or anything from people, or beyond a tweet that says, "Hey, this interview's out there." But David um, gave me a note that Chuck had sent to him that was really, "Hey, I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed our interview. I really felt it was one of the deeper ones for this." And he wrote the bottom, "I know it definitely was not one of the most boring ones. I had a lot of those." I'm like, okay. And that meant a lot to me, because that was somebody who I looked up to, telling me something that was so inertly positive.
That's really awesome. You have been on this whole crazy journey of writing and marketing and pro wrestling and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about what have you really learned about storytelling that you feel like is kind of universal from all of these different mediums? And maybe like, can you talk about how it is different in each medium that you've worked in?
I mean, that's a lot of media.
It is, I know.
Um,
So that's
so,
why I'm
so,
saying start with how it's unified.
so yeah. So there is, I think the one unifying factor about story is that we all want it, even if we don't admit it.
Mm,
Especially when it comes to marketing something. If you watch Mad Men back in that time era, marketing was very subliminal, but it was subliminal because it had to be. Because back then, people didn't, people weren't focused on story. They really just wanted information and how it benefits them. And I think over time, we've evolved as audiences and consumers, and what something is about is just as important as what it actually is, what it is about, what story is behind something. And I really think viral marketing had a big impact on how the audience digests advertising to them. I think you can really point to the one blip in time that went all in on it, a company I think called 42 West, for The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan, Christian Bale, Heath Ledger movie, went all in on using the movie to craft a story in the real world that people could participate in.
I remember that.
You had
Yeah.
people going to bowling. You had people scrambling to bowling alleys to try to open a locker to get a $50 bowling ball that somebody painted.
Uh-huh.
You had, dozens or hundreds of people marching in a fake protest down Hollywood Boulevard chanting, "We believe in Harvey Dent." And the movie did amazing, obviously. It would have done amazing regardless, even with a basic marketing touch. But I think that kind of marketing gave the audience something to latch onto that made them want to watch it multiple times
It was
to
like,
get those deeper details.
yeah, it was like, it wasn't just the come see this movie. It's on at this time. It has these people in it. It was there is a story happening around this movie that you can participate in.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of that really kind of evolved from that point. Even graphic design, billboard design, everything great inherently tells you some kind of story. So I think that's really what story has in common through all mediums is that it's effective. We all want it, whether we really realize it or not, and how much it impacts us.
Hmm.
And I think there is a difference in telling a story in journalism because you're trying to be objective, but you're also trying to be entertaining. Telling a story in, well, let's do like live events, conventions like PlayStation Experience, you crafted an entire, universe or a universe of these with these worlds that people went to and interacted with these things from games that they loved. So you immersed them in what those narratives were.
Hmm.
So you added to that, but the experience in and itself, the goal is to put you in a story and to give you a story to tell afterwards. That's how you really, that's how you grow. That's how you get word of mouth in the modern era.
The audience member is the one who is participating in this
Yeah.
story and then telling the story afterwards
Uh,
is how it's working in marketing, but also in a lot of other effective types of media, essentially.
yeah. And because really, if you tell good stories in what you do, then you make people into good storytellers and they will present you and your work in a way that really helps you to be noticed by everyone around them.
Hmm.
So it is viral is still a thing in this day and age, and it's a powerful thing. And I think so, obviously when I was learning the sort of ins and outs of the wrestling business, I always knew there were stories going into that because of what you saw on TV, good versus evil, this versus that.
Hmm.
But I never really understood the language of it and how to convey that, how to write this stuff, how to time this stuff, how to measure the impact of whether it was successful until I got into the backstage of that business. And I think wrestling has the most similarities to books and movies and television story because at the end of the day, you're really you're putting on a Broadway show for someone. It's just more sweaty and punchy.
I mean, it really is like the medium and the language is a little bit different, but it is essentially a play.
Yeah.
It is a high impact play with a lot of risk and a lot of potential for shit to go wrong, which is also why it's enjoyable. But you're essentially seeing a live improv performance every time you're watching a wrestling match. And there's a lot of excitement in that, and there's a lot of potential for that kind of story that only comes with live theater, has
Hmm.
that special impact to it.
Oh yeah, 1,000%. And then when you jump into some of the other things that I've been doing more recently, say the Comic Con marketing and events and putting those things together, there's there are people that do what I do in a way that just craps something out on a schedule and they think it's good. And
Who are we talking about, David?
yeah, so I'll name names. I mean,
No, it's
but
okay.
so my goal and what people didn't understand in that is the objective of those kinds of things is to give people a moment that
Mhm.
they remember, that they can talk about, even if it's just for a couple of days, even if it's just for the rest of the afternoon, or maybe it's something they'll talk about a year from now that they really, really remembered. That's the goal. And when you're working with a lot of celebrities who have such great experiences and stories to tell, you have to get that out of them because they don't necessarily know right off the bat, like, oh, I'm going to go on the stage and I'm going to talk about this, this, and this. So you send them a note, you talk with them backstage, you say, hey, would you mind talking about this? Can you talk about that? And then you set up sort of like these moments for people that they can feel like they were part of something, that they laughed at something that was only available to them in that moment. And it's a form of storytelling in a way because your object is to set up to elicit an emotion,
Mhm.
which is at the heart of all storytelling. So that's what separated me from anyone else in that field. And I think my friend Kristen, who's also done a few shows,
And was on this podcast.
and was on this podcast
Chris Simon.
and officiated our
And
wedding.
officiated our
So
wedding. Yep.
um, she gets that too. So she understands that, and she's really good about the educational aspect of it and wanting to give people information that they didn't have before. So we have different sort of philosophies in that, but objectively, we both understand that we want to create moments. And in helping our friend Sig, he he has a great show, and we see like it's hard to do that there because it's very limited in space and everything. But honestly, even he gets that you give us a little bit of freedom, we will create something that is memorable, that meets that goal and that objective. There's a lot, God, in talking about my journey in my life with you, you know, there's so much stuff I didn't even talk about,
Well, yeah. I mean, that would be a whole different podcast,
that,
like to go into the backstory of all that.
yeah, I have too much backstory. I really need, who's the worst exposition writer, like just exposition dump constantly for unearned reasons.
Oh,
To me, I would say it's, gosh,
oh, you mean like TV writer?
any writer in any medium.
Why do you think it's Joss? That doesn't even make sense.
I just feel like
You just don't like Joss Whedon. That has
that's
nothing.
a completely different podcast. Go listen to None of My Friends Like Comics with my good friend Nick Poffenberger, who we talked about Astonishing X-Men at that point. But
What does that have to do with Joss Whedon?
I just don't like that he dumps exposition on in just the worst times in a lot of his stuff. I don't like him for a lot of reasons, but I think that's one technical reason I don't like.
I feel like you just brought up that question so that you could have a reason to shit on Joss Whedon on two podcasts.
Oh man! And then once I have my podcast with
Yeah.
Kristen, there'll be a third.
At a certain point, he's going to reach out and cease and desist.
And let him try.
Where can people find you if they want to follow you on any of your
Any of
creative
my current
endeavors?
creative endeavors.
Yes.
So we are starting the This is Con Life podcast with myself and my friend Kristen Simon, where we talk about our experiences putting together fan cons, trade shows, um, just in general pop culture experiences. I've done it for more than a decade now. She's also done it for well, just as long with a lot of publishers and video game companies too, actually, that I think about it. So, This is Con Life should be dropping soon on the preferred podcast platform of your choice. And you can follow me on social media on Instagram at Lightly Mexican, which is the PG name because do you remember what my previous Instagram handle was?
Yes.
You want to say it on air? Can you say it on air?
It was Butt Stuff Dracula.
Omega butt stuff Dracula.
What is the Omega? What is that part of it?
I don't know. I needed another word.
Is that a reference to Kenny Omega?
Well, no. It's literally just kind of like the random word generator thrown in there.
I think Butt Stuff Dracula is a random word generator.
I don't know.
I've seen you use that in multiple places.
People miss that, and you can. I'm hoping that someday you'll be able to find me on PlayStation Network under the name, but hopefully they'll lift their ban on that.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more from David, you can follow him on Instagram at Lightly Mexican. Yes, that's what it's called now, not the other thing. And keep an eye out for the Con Life podcast coming soon. If you're in need of editing services, check out my website, midwrite.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at midwriteworlds. If you are enjoying the show, it really helps me out if you would leave a rating and review on your preferred podcasting service, maybe even on your less preferred podcasting services. And of course, if you have any ideas for the show, for topics or guests, just send them my way at edibuddiespod@gmail.com. Let's talk soon.